Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Gimel. Daf 13 of Masechta Yoma. Daf 13 is like a funny little daf. Like the daf starts off talking about like the different backups of the Kohen Gadol, either because maybe it will become tummy or maybe his wife will die. But that discussion leads into this like very technical discussion about, well, how does he actually marry another wife for Yom Kippur? It gets into like funny theoretical get setups, which gets really confusing. Well, that's like most of the daf, and then we get shtickle into like halachos of a Kohen Gadol of an onein, who's an onein a little bit later. So let's jump in, friends. Cool. Let's start on daf Yud Gimel. I hope that's what we're up to. Pretty sure that's what we're up to. So I'm going to go with that. So Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, about 5 lines into the page. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Isha Acheres Maskina Lo, says Rabbi Yehuda that we also set aside for the Kohen Gadol a backup wife. Just in case his wife dies, because it says right that he's going to atone for himself and for his household. Beso zo ishto, and therefore when it says Beso, his household, it means his wife, so he has to have a wife. So Rabbi Yehuda says, look, if his wife dies, he has to have a backup. Okay. Now, from the fact that the rabbis say that we set aside a backup Kohen Gadol just in case the Kohen Gadol becomes puzzle, the primary Kohen Gadol becomes puzzle, so we set aside a backup Kohen Gadol. So clearly the rabbis are also concerned about stuff happening. Therefore, why are they not concerned about his wife dying? So the rabbis will say to you, Tuma shchicha mislo shchicha, that becoming tameh is much more common than becoming dead. And therefore, while it's a possibility that the Kohen Gadol might become tameh, the possibility of his wife dying is less common. Okay. Weiter. Amru lo imkein ein ladavar sof. So the rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, look, Rabbi Yehuda, if you're going to say that you have to set aside a backup wife just in case his wife dies, well then why do you draw the line there? Maybe the backup wife will die. Maybe the double backup wife will die. Like where do you draw the line? So Shapakam Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, look, the rabbis taka have a good kasha. Where do you draw the line? So Rabbi Yehuda Amalach, Lemisa Chashinan, Lemisa Detaiti Lo Chashinan. Rabbi Yehuda responds to the rabbis and he says, look, I draw the line after one. That's what I do. It's not particularly common that somebody's going to just drop dead on Yom Kippur morning. So therefore, okay, fine. Well, just in case, we'll be concerned that what if his wife dies and he has to have his wife, so we set a backup. We're not going to go so far as to say that the backup might also die. And whereas the rabbis say, look, things have to be objective over here. And therefore, if we are in fact going to be concerned about one wife dying, then we have to be concerned about two wives dying. And if we're not concerned about two wives dying, then we're not concerned about one wife dying. And therefore the rabbis say you don't need to set aside any wives, and that is that. To which the Gemara says, why don't the rabbis take their theory and apply it to themselves? The rabbis are saying to Rabbi Yehuda, look, if you're going to be concerned that one wife is going to die, then where are you going to draw the line? If you're concerned about one wife, you have to be concerned about all wives, and therefore you can't, therefore just don't even get started. Don't set aside any wives. Hey rabbis, don't you say that you set aside a Kohen Gadol, a backup, just in case the Kohen Gadol becomes puzzle? Well, where do you draw the line? If you have to be concerned that the first Kohen Gadol is going to become puzzle, then shouldn't you have to be concerned that the second Kohen Gadol is going to become puzzle, and then maybe the third, etc., and weiter and weiter? So Amr Lach Rabbanan Kohen Gadol Zarisu. So the rabbis give an interesting answer, interesting more in the way that it will unfold in the next line. But the rabbis say, the truth is that the Kohen Gadol is Zariz. He's very on top of things, and he's not really going to become puzzle. Well, Izarisu Lama Misak Maskinin Kohen Acher. Well, if that's the case, that the Kohen Gadol is so on top of things that he's not actually going to become puzzle, well then why do we set aside a backup? So listen to their answer. Kevin the Avdinan le Tsara Kol Shekin the Mizdar is Tfei. Love it. The backup is just there to give extra incentive, extra motivation. Kilu, the Kohen Gadol is Zariz. The Kohen Gadol is very, motivated. He's very on top of things. He's not going to become Tameh. Now, he's not going to become Pasul. Well, if that's the case, why do we set aside backup Kohen Gadol? To give extra motivation. Because certainly, how could he possibly become Pasul when he knows that if he becomes Pasul, this guy is going to take over for him? Right? How could he possibly allow that guy to take over for him? So therefore, it's going to make him even more motivated than he already is, and certainly there's no chance that he's going to become Pasul. So very interesting. So really it's a psychological play, according to the rabbis, that the whole reason why we set aside a backup Kohen Gadol is just to have extra incentive for the primary Kohen Gadol to remain kosher. Okay. Now we are kind of slowly transitioning into the interesting hole of I don't know if is hole what's that called? Like when you jump into a hole, rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is beginning to open. Umisagile bitakantas beso. No, bitakanta. So the Gemara asks, wait, does setting aside a backup wife actually help? What does setting aside a wife do? He's not married to her. Well, we're just setting aside a wife that theoretically could be his wife. They're not married. So let's say his wife dies. He doesn't actually have a second wife. So the Mekadesh. So he betroths her. He's Mekadesh her. So that he does in fact have a second wife, and therefore if the first wife dies, then he's already married to the second wife. But as long as he doesn't bring her to live with him in his house, so then she's not actually considered part of his household. So even if he gives her a shava pruta and says Ariat Mikudeshesli, that's not enough. He actually has to marry her. He's got to bring her into his house and live with her. So the Kanisla, he taka does that. He brings her in. Mamish, he before Yom Kippur, he mamish marries a second wife. And now he has two wives. But the Gemara is not satisfied. Imkain, hav lishnei batim. Well, if that's the case, then he has two houses, so to speak. The Pasuk says that he atones for himself and for his house, not for his houses, for a singular house. So if Mamish marries a second wife before Yom Kippur, then he has two wives. But he needs to only have one wife. So it's like a funny kind of play over here, because on the one hand, we have to be careful because if his wife dies, so then he doesn't have a wife. But if he sets up a backup wife, he'll actually have to marry her, but if he marries her, then he has two wives. So how do you set up a situation where he will certainly always have one wife? That he'll have one wife when he's supposed to have one wife, and if that wife dies, then there's memela, a backup wife. So how does this work? So the Gemara suggests the Hada Megarishla. Well, he marries the second wife and then divorces the second wife. But if he marries her and then divorces her, then we're just back at square one, which is that he's got one wife, and if that one wife dies, then he doesn't have a second one. So guys, get ready. Take my word for it. It gets very, very confusing. We just got to go slow and go with the confusion. What do you want me to tell you? So, lo tzrichdim garishla al tanai. Okay. So, he divorces the second wife under the following condition. The Amarla, he says to the second wife, Hareze gitech al manas shetamusi. This is your divorce bill, your bill of divorce, under the condition that you die. So then, as long as she dies, she's divorced. And then he doesn't have the issue of two wives. And as Rashi points out, these are not exactly like the most solid cases. Even Rashi says it. He says it in a few lines, Keilu, that there are lots of questions that you can ask on the following cases. And Rashi says that a number of times, like in the Gemara, like in Shas, so to speak. That Keilu says that sometimes the Gemara will just say something that isn't necessarily the most solid ukimta, the most solid case, but it's going to throw it out anyways. Don't get too caught up on the details. What's going to be important here is really the conclusion that we're going to get in about another Amud. Fine. So he says he says to the second wife, this is your bill of divorce under the condition that you die. But what if she doesn't die? If the second wife doesn't die, well then she'll still be his wife, and then he'll have two wives. So that's not going to work. Okay, so he says to the second wife, this is your divorce document under the condition that you don't die. So if Yom Kippur comes and they're still married, well, if Yom Kippur comes and second wife is still alive, well, then they're divorced, and then he's only got one wife. Well, so ilo mesa migar shala. So if when Yom Kippur comes, the second wife is still alive, so then they're divorced. V'i mesa, and if she dies, hakai mahach. Well, the first wife is still alive, so he's got a wife, right? If the second wife is still alive, well, then she's divorced, and if she dies, well, he's still got the first wife. But vidilma hilo mesa. But what happens if the second wife does not die? So the second wife is alive when Yom Kippur comes, which means that they're divorced. V'havale gita dahai gita, right? Which means that they're divorced. But umayse chaverta, and then the first wife dies. V'kam le below bias, and now he doesn't have any wives. So that's not going to work. Oh, okay. So now this next one literally doesn't make sense. Like, I think there are people that skip it. We'll just read it and it won't make sense. Okay, ela de'amar la. So he says to the second wife, Almanas shetamus achas mikem. Okay, so second wife, you're divorced if one of you die. All right. So mesa ha kaimahach. So if the second wife dies, well, then the first one is still married. All right. Mesa hach. Now, if the first one dies, ha kaimaha, then the second one is still around. The problem is the second one isn't still around, because that was the whole point. If one of them dies, then the second one is now divorced. So that doesn't really make sense. V'dimulo maisa what v'lo chadaminayu v'avele shnei batim. Okay, but the Gemara says, yeah, but what if, like, and maybe like this is like what Rashi was saying, that there's all sorts of questions you can ask. So I guess, yeah, you can ask that this thing just like, yeah, sure. The Gemara says, yeah, what happens if neither one of them dies? So then both of them are still married. But you can also ask that the case just doesn't make any sense, because if the first one dies, then the second one's divorced. Okay, v'od, and more so, ki gavna mi hava gita, and then the Gemara says, would this even work to say that, like, this is your divorce document as long as you're alive, kilu, and if you die, then it kicks in, so to speak? Ve'amar Rava says, areza gitech, right? You're not allowed to have divorce documents that kind of last your entire life. Right? If a guy says to his wife that he's divorcing, this is your get under the condition that you don't drink any wine as long as I'm alive and as long as you're alive. So basically, this is your get as long as for the rest of your life you don't drink wine. Now, that doesn't work. Ein ze krisos. This isn't considered a cutting away, meaning the pasuk says, "V'nosan get krisos, v'chosav get krisos v'nosan biyada," that he has to give her a bill of like separation. Now, if she's kind of like connected to this document until the day that she dies, it's not very much a parting document, because she's still attached to the fellow, because she can't drink wine for the rest of her life because of this document. So she's still connected in that way. But if the condition is that this is your bill of divorce as long as you do not drink any wine during the life of so-and-so, well, then that's acceptable, because if so-and-so dies, well, then, the condition is done. So it has the ability to kind of end while she's alive, and then at least there's a possibility of them being completely separated. Okay, here we go. You guys ready to go weiter? Ella de Omarla. So rather, the Kohen Gadol says to the second wife, Hareza gitech, this is your divorce document. Almanas shelo tamus chavertech. Okay, this is your divorce document as long as the first wife does not die. okay, let's flip that to be sort of the positive, like not the negative, double negative, confusing stuff. So again, so let's read it in the negative and then we'll flip it to the positive. So this is your divorce document if the first wife does not die. So meaning, as long as the first wife is still alive when Yom Kippur comes, so then the second wife is divorced. All right? Ilo mesa chaverta migarsha. So if the first wife does not die, i.e. if the first wife is still alive when Yom Kippur comes, so then the second wife is divorced. V'imesa ha okaima ha. And if the first wife does die, well then the second wife is alive, is around and married, so it's cool. So that seems like it should work, right? So as long as the first wife is alive when Yom Kippur comes, the second wife is divorced. And if the first wife dies when Yom Kippur comes, so then the second wife is still married, in which case he's makes sure that he has a wife in any event. But But what if the first wife dies in the middle of the avoda? Which means that, so what happened? When Yom Kippur started, so then the first wife was alive, which means that the second wife was divorced, right? Now here's the thing. When the first wife dies in the middle of the avoda, then retroactively, it means that he was actually, because the condition is that if the first wife dies, well then the original wife is still, the second wife is still married. So what that means is that when the first wife dies in the middle of the avoda, so then retroactively, from the time that the bill of divorce was given to the second wife, they were still married, because since the first wife died, so then the second wife is still married, which means that when he started doing the avoda, he was married to two wives, because the first wife was still alive, and retroactively, from the time that the first wife dies in the middle of the avoda, the second wife retroactively was still married to the Kohen Gadol at the time that he started the avoda, and the first wife was still alive, so he was married to two wives, and that we know that that's not gishmak, right? The igli milsa limafreya, which means that retroactively the gita daha lav gita. So retroactively, the get of the second wife was not a good get. Who ve'avid le'avoda b'shnei batim, which means that at the time that the Kohen Gadol started doing the avoda, he had two wives, and you have to have one. Okay. Ella, de Amarla. Rather, what he said to the second wife is, Hareza gitech, this is your divorce document. Amanas shetamus chavertech. This is your divorce document under the condition that the first wife does die. Okay? So if the first wife dies, so then the second wife is divorced. Which means that if the first wife is alive, then the second wife is still married. Which means Vidilma Maisa Chaverta. Okay, Beseder, I guess it's not going there, unless I maybe even confuse something. But anyways, Vidilma Maisa Chaverta, Vavale Gita de Gita Vakamle Below Bais. What happens? Right? Remember, he's saying that this is your bill of divorce if the first wife dies. So what happens if the first wife does in fact die, and then this is a bill of divorce, and then the first wife is dead and the second wife is divorced, he doesn't have a wife. Alright? Okay, so now the Gemara makes kind of a new suggestion, which is El de Megarish Lu Tarvayu. Okay, so he divorces both of them. Alright? L'chada Amarla. Now to one of them, let's say the second wife. So he says to the second wife, Hare Zagitech, this is your divorce document. Amanas shelo tamus chavertech. As long as the first wife does not die, meaning if when Yom Kippur comes, the first wife is alive, so then you, second wife, are divorced. And what he says to the first wife is, Hare Zagitech, this is your divorce. Amanas shelo tikansi leveis hakneses. If you don't go to the synagogue, then we're divorced. If you go to the synagogue, then we're not divorced. If you don't make it to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, then we're divorced. But what happens if the first wife is alive when Yom Kippur comes, which means that the second wife is divorced? V'lo aylehi lebeis hakneses, and the first wife does not go to synagogue, well then, havale gita de tarvayu gita. Then that means that both of the gets are kosher gets, become libelo bias, and he doesn't have any wives. Okay, so here, I believe that the following one is going to be the one that we're going to stick with, and it's a very interesting case. Ella, rather, lechada omar la, he says to the second wife, meaning to one of them he says, so let's just keep it consistent with how we've been, that he's talking to the second wife. So he says to the second wife, Harei zegitech, this is your bill of divorce, almanas shelo tamus chavertech, under the condition that the first wife doesn't die. So meaning, if when Yom Kippur comes, the first wife is alive, you, second wife, are divorced. What he says to the first wife is, this is your bill of divorce. If I go into the synagogue, you are divorced. So now listen to this. So if when Yom Kippur comes, the first wife is dead, so then the divorce of the second wife is irrelevant, and he's married to the second wife. He's got a wife. Great. Maisa hakaimaha. I don't know what just happened. The imaisa hakaimaha, meaning if the first wife dies, well then the second wife is still married. The imaisa ha, and if the second wife dies, well then hakaimaha, the first wife is alive. Great. Fine. Now, right, if the second one dies, then the first wife is still alive and married. Now, so what's the kasha you could theoretically ask? The halfway through the avoda kasha. Yeah, but what if when Yom Kippur comes, the first wife is alive, which means that the second wife is divorced. Okay, all good. But then the first wife dies halfway through the avoda, which means that, well, when the Kohen Gadol started doing the avoda, he was still married to the first wife, but then when she dies in the middle, retroactively, he was still married, right? Retroactively, the get of the second wife is not a get, and they're still married. Which means that when the Kohen Gadol started doing the avoda, he was married to both wives. Again, when the Kohen Gadol started doing the avoda, the first wife was still alive, which means that he was divorced from the second wife. Great. But then when the first wife dies, retroactively, he's still married to the second wife, which means that already from at the time that he began doing the avoda, he was then married to two wives because the first one was not yet dead. But listen what he does. Listen what he does. Brilliant. Okay, and the issue would be that in this case he would be starting to do the avoda with two wives. Now, and if he sees that she's going to die, if he sees that the first wife is going to die, he just runs into the synagogue, because remember the condition that he made? If I run into the synagogue, then we're divorced retroactively. And he makes the bill of divorce for the first wife kick in retroactively, which means that they're already divorced at the time that she dies, but he's still married to the second wife because the first one died. That's funny, right? So because if the first one dies, so then retroactively he's going to be married to the second one, which means that when he started to do the avoda, he was married to the second one still, and he was also still married to the first one because she was still alive. But by running into the synagogue, he then kicks in the bill of divorce of the first one to be retroactive, which means that since she's dead, so then the second wife is still married to him, but because he ran to the synagogue, he kicked in the divorce document of the first wife, which means that he's not married to the first wife, he's only married to the second wife. Alright, very nice. What do you want me to tell you? But Lemaisa, I guess according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's what's going on over here. We set up a backup wife in such a manner, because he can't actually be married, but he can't also not be married, so he's got to make this convoluted, as we like to say, fakakta setup, so that either way he's married to just one. So if the first wife is alive, so he's married to the first wife. But in the event that the first wife dies, so then he can kind of run into he works it out, so he could make it so that he's then married to the second wife. Very, very interesting stuff. In fact, the Gemara Maskef Ravasi asks a kasha v'temer v'avira elemeata. But let me ask you a kasha. If we said that because it says beso, and beso is singular, so therefore it means right. We said earlier beso is singular, so therefore he can only have one wife, right? So let me ask you a kasha. When it says by yibum yivimto is singular. So what about the case where you have a fellow who's married to two wives and he pasha dies? So if you have a fellow who's married to one wife and he dies and they don't have children, so then the wife marries his brother, right? So, but what if he's married to two wives? Do the two wives marry the brother-in-law? That sounds interesting. Anyways, so it says Yivimto is singular. So what if Yivdo has two wives? How does that work out? So the Gemara says, well, so if you have two Yivamis in one house, should they not do Yibum? So the Gemara says, well, Yivimto Riba. It says Yivimto twice. Oh wait, no, I think I made a mistake there. I don't think that's learning out from Yivimto being singular. I think it's learning out from the fact that it says in the context of Yivama, of Yibum, it says bias. And if we're saying that Beso is singular and therefore it excludes two wives, so then bias is singular when it comes to Yibum, so it should exclude a situation where the guy was married to two wives. To which we say Yivimto, it says Yivimto in the pasuk twice to include even a fellow who's married to two wives. Ravina asked the kasha v'temer of Sheirevia elamei ata arusa lo tisyabim. So what about an arusa? Right, because we said earlier that it wouldn't be enough to just be makadesh. It wouldn't be enough to just be makadesh this, right? The Kohen Gadol can't just be makadesh this backup wife. He mamish has to marry her and bring her into the house. So here also by Yibum, where it says bias, then if they were engaged and then he dies, so then maybe Yibum wouldn't apply. So the Gemara says, no, hachutza l'rabas arusa. That when the pasuk says, what does the pasuk say? It says, lo sia eishes ames hachutza, that the wife of the deceased shouldn't be outside, meaning, and we're learning off from that we even include the external outer, like, rings, ke'ilu, like, even somebody who's just, betrothed but not actually married would be included in Yibum. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Kohen Gadol makriv onen ve'eno ochel. Okay, as we've learned a few times, that the Kohen Gadol, if he's an onen, if a relative passed away and was not yet buried, so the chiddush is that the Kohen Gadol is allowed to do service in the Beis Hamikdash. A regular Kohen cannot, but a Kohen Gadol can. However, ve'eno ochel, but he doesn't eat kodshim as an onen, which is the whole thing with like Aharon and the children, because if Nadav and Avihu died, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, why don't you eat the carbon? They said, well, we don't eat as an onen. Okay. So the Kohen Gadol is allowed to offer sacrifices in the temple as an onen, he just doesn't eat them. Rabbi Yehuda omer kol hayom. Rabbi Yehuda says all day. And the question is, my kol hayom? What does it mean Rabbi Yehuda says all day? So Rabba says, Rabba lo nitzcha el la'avio mitoch beso. So it says Rabba, what it means is that kol hayom kilu, we dafka bring him, it's a mitzvah, we dafka bring him to the Beis HaMikdash so that he can do the avoda as an onen. That's what it means. Amle Abaye says to Rabba, Hashel Rabbi Yehuda afuke mafkinon le. But one second, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we see dafka the opposite, that we get rid of him. The Tanya is within the Brisa, Yo'omiru makav al gabe mizbeach. If you have a Kohen Hedyot, not a Kohen Gadol, if you have a Kohen Hedyot, who's doing the avoda, he's offering korbanos, he's on the mizbeach, v'shamash shemes lomes, and he heard that that's a relative passed away, so he's an onen. Maniach avodaso v'yotze div Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that he's got to stop what he's doing and get out of there because he's an onen. Rabbi Yossi almost says Rabbi Yossi yigmor, let him finish what he's doing and then go. So we see that by a Kohen Hedyot, Rabbi Yehuda is the more stringent opinion. So if Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent, albeit by Kohen Hedyot, but he's the more stringent opinion when it comes to an onen, so then why would all of a sudden, when it comes to Kohen Gadol, we're like encouraging him to do the avoda as an onen? If Rabbi Yehuda takes the more stringent opinion by aninus, by Kohen Hedyot, why would he take the exact opposite opinion when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, and that we want to encourage him to go and do the avoda. So Rabbi says that doesn't make sense. And Rabbi, you're suggesting that what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that Dafka, when it comes to a Kohen Gadol, we're going to bring him from his house, take him to the Beis Hamikdash, encourage him to do the avoda. Why is he kind of like having the exact opposite stance when it comes to Kohen Hedron versus Kohen Gadol? Rather Rava suggests, my kol hayom. What does it mean all day? Lomar she'eno oved kol hayom. What it means is that he Dafka doesn't do the avoda all day. Meaning the Tanna Kama says that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to offer korbanos as an onen. He just doesn't eat them. Says Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rava, that no, he doesn't do the avoda all day. Technically he can, but he doesn't. How come? Gezer shema yocha, because we're concerned that he might end up eating the meat, and he's not allowed to eat the meat. So out of concern that he might end up eating meat, so then we don't have the Kohen Gadol do the avoda at all, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now listen to this. He says, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda shema yocha. Is Rabbi Yehuda really concerned that he might end up eating, that if the Kohen Gadol eats, if the Kohen Gadol does the avoda as an onen, he might end up eating the meat, which he's not allowed to do, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda would say that he's not allowed to work in the avoda, in the Beis Hamikdash as an onen? But listen to this kasha. V'atnan, but we learn in a Mishnah, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, af isha acheres maskinin lo, shema tamus ishto. That says Rabbi Yehuda that we set up a backup wife for him, just in case he dies. No, not he dies. That would be a problem. Just in case she dies, just in case his wife dies, so then he'll have a backup wife. You hear that? So what do we see? So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, he has no problem that if the Kohen Gadol's wife dies on Yom Kippur, so he's got a backup wife, set up, so that he can continue to do the avoda on Yom Kippur, even though he's an onen. And we're not concerned that he might end up eating. Omerle, to which Rava says to Ravada bar Ahava, Hachi ashta hasam, came Yom Kippurimu, Duchliamilo ka'achle, Hunamilo asi lemecho. To which Rava says, that's not such a, it's a very interesting question, but it's not a very good question per se, because we're talking about Yom Kippur. Nobody's eating on Yom Kippur. Rava says, look, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that in general, on a regular day of the year, a Kohen Gadol, if he's an onen, he shouldn't do the avoda because everybody else is eating kodshim. Everyone else is eating pashet barbecue there in the Beis Hamikdash. So we're concerned that the Kohen Gadol might also end up eating. However, on Yom Kippur, in the event that the Kohen Gadol's wife would die and he would be an onen, he would still be able to do the avoda because nobody's eating. We're not concerned that he's going to end up eating. To which the Gemara says, wait a second. What was the ukimta of the backup wife? The ukimta of the backup wife was this crazy situation where the first wife was still alive when Yom Kippur started, so he was divorced from the second wife, but then she died, so he quickly ran to the synagogue so that he'll be divorced from the first one retroactively. So Memela, he wasn't married to the first wife at the time that she died, so he wasn't even an onen b'chal. So what's the kasha? Alright. So the Gemara says, yeah, but granted, fine. So maybe maybe aninus isn't technically the issue, right? Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda, we want to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Kohen Gadol can't be makav as an onen because he might end up eating, right? So we say, fine, maybe that's technically speaking not the issue because he divorced her, fine. But there's another issue, is that in order to eat kodshim, you have to be besimcha. You have to be happy. And over here, he's onen, he's sad, and therefore he wouldn't be able to, he wouldn't be allowed to eat kodshim because he's sad. I mean, even though he might not be an onen because he technically divorced her, but his wife just died. His wife that he divorced a second ago because of a technicality just died. So he'll be kind of upset, and he's not allowed to eat kodshim in that state, and still we're not concerned that that he's going to end up eating it on Yom Kippur. Fine. That was Daf Yud Gimel. What can I tell you? What do you guys think about Daf Yud Gimel? There was some interesting stuff there at the beginning about like the Chacham, for example. They responded to Rabbi Yehuda. They said, look, Rabbi Yehuda, where do you draw the line? The rabbis say, look, according to us, you don't set up any backup wives because, if you're going to set up one backup wife, then you have to be concerned that, well, that one's going to die, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Where do you draw the line? So therefore, they say no backup wives. The interesting thing is that their opinion when it comes to Tuma, or like becoming pasul, is that actually they're not concerned that the Kohen Gadol is actually going to become pasul, because he's very on top of things. Rather, the backup thing is really just to give extra incentive to make sure that he's not going to become pasul, because he knows that if he becomes pasul, then this nudnik is going to take over, and he doesn't want that. So anyway, so that was interesting. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we draw the line after one. If his wife dies, we have one waiting. We're not concerned that one's going to die. Then we got into this whole interesting thing about, but technically speaking, how does it work if he sets up a backup wife? He's not actually married to her. He's got to be married to her. So they talk get married. Yeah, but then he can't be married to two. We gave all sorts of backs and forths, very confusing, some of it. And in the end, we basically concluded that what it's talking about is that he makes these deals with both of the wives. And he says, look, he says to wife 2, if wife 1 is still alive, then you're divorced, then I'm married to her, right? And then he says to wife 2, he says, look, if I if I step into the synagogue, then you're divorced. And then what happens is that even in the event that, so if the first wife dies before Yom Kippur, well then he's going to be retroactively married to the second wife and he's got a wife. If the first wife is alive throughout Yom Kippur, so then he's retroactively divorced from the second wife. That gets a little fancy when the first wife dies in the middle of Yom Kippur, so then retroactively he was married to the second wife from the beginning of Yom Kippur, which means that at the time that he did the avoda, he was married to 2 women, which is a problem. However, what he did was right before the first one died, he ran into the synagogue so that he could divorce her retroactively, so that then retroactively he was only married to the second one when Yom Kippur started, when he started doing the avoda. All right, very, very interesting. And then we got into this interesting question about Kohen Gadol being makriv onein. Right, so we said that Tanna Kama says that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash as an onein if a relative passes away before they are buried. However, he may not eat as an onein. Now, then the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda says kol hayom. The question is, what does it mean kol hayom? Rabbi's opinion is that what kol hayom means is that we encourage him to go to the Beis Hamikdash and do the avodah as long as when he's an onein. Abai says that doesn't make sense. Just contextually, that wouldn't be the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So says Rava that what it means is that even though technically speaking the Kohen Gadol can do the avoda, Rabbi Yehuda would say that he does not do the avoda because we're concerned that he might end up eating. Chaver, that was Daf Yud Gimel. I hope you enjoyed. Go rest up a little bit, then I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.